everyone, Krista Moser here. Today I thought I would show you how to sew bias binding onto a scalloped edged quilt. So scallop edges are really fun. They can make a simple quilt look really interesting and a lot more complicated. So what we have here is what's called a scallop. So it's got a hill and a valley. Sometimes those valleys come to peaks. The way I do my scallops, it's just a rounded hill and a rounded valley, so they're a little easier to bind that way. So some of you may have seen my YouTube video last year on my scallop border template. So that's what I use. It's a Creative Grids template where you've got your corners and then you have the choice of a small, medium, and large scallop. So that's just how deep that scallop would be cut. I like to use this on simple quilts and just make them look a lot more complicated. So that's what I've got here. Many of you probably saw my blog from last week on the piecing of this charm square quilt, and then I just added a border to the outside edge and then cut it as a scallop. So it's going to be very sweet. It's really an easy project to do, so I suggest you go look at the blog from last week at kristamoser.com and see how to make the actual quilt part of it. And today is the scalloped edge and the binding of it. So what you need for a scalloped edge is bias binding. So what I've already done here is prepped my binding. Bias binding, unlike regular straight of grain or cross grain binding, which is just cut as strips and sewn together, it needs to be cut on the diagonal. So I actually did a YouTube video a while back on how to cut your binding on the bias and then sew it end to end. So I've actually already done that. I will put a link to that video in the description. I'll also put a link to the video on how to cut your scallops in the description as well. So all of that will be there. You can watch those videos and figure out how we get to this point. So once you're here, you've got your binding all prepped. I've pressed it in half. Now I cut my binding 2 1/4 inches. I like a nice kind of dainty binding, so 2 1/4 inches is really kind of nice for that. And then I've got my quilt all quilted. I marked my scallops and quilted up to the scallop and then trimmed the batting and backing away. And so it's all ready to go. So where to start? I'm actually going to sew my binding to the back of the quilt, roll it to the front, and top stitch it down. So you can do this whole process the other way, sewing it to the front, rolling it to the back, and then hand stitching it. That's a little more orthodox, but I tend to do double machine binding. So I'll sew it to the back, roll it to the front. So when I get started here, what we've got, you can see the edge. I've got hills and valleys. So I'm actually going to start my binding just on the slope of a hill, headed up. So I'm going to leave this section here in the valley wide open. So let me grab my binding here, and just like any binding, you leave yourself a good tail to start with, maybe 6 inches or so. So I'm actually just going to start here with a nice tail in the valley. So I'm kind of on the upside of the hill, and when I've sewn all the way around and I come to join those two, this end and the end coming into it, I'm going to stop on the other, just on the downside of the hill, leaving most of this valley open so that I can get my join nice and even. Now I don't pin the binding on, I just sort of feed it into the machine as I go, and that is part of the technique I'm going to show you. There's a couple things that are important because we've got hills, so that's an outside curve. Bias binding will stretch, it's manipulatable, and so that's really important because as you're going the outside curves, you need it to really curve and curl over the top. And then in the valley, it's cupped. So you're going to give your binding just a little tension. I'm going to kind of tug on it just a little bit. Not a ton, but just a little bit so that it really sucks into that valley. So that is something I'll just walk you through here. So I'm going to get a camera close to the machine and I'm going to start sewing. Okay, so what we've got going here, I've got it in the machine and I'm on just the crown of the hill. So I'm just going to use my fingers and just kind of place the binding around the crown of the hill. Now I'm not stretching it here. I'm actually kind of doing the opposite of stretching. I'm almost feeding a little extra in. And I'm just going to get started with a little back stitch. And every every few inches, stop and readjust and feed a little bit more in. Okay, I made it around just the crown. Now I'm going into the valley. So here again, now this is the side that you give it a little stretch. So coming into the valley, I'm going to tug it so it pulls it a little bit snug. You can kind of see that cupping. That's what you wanted to do. So not pulling it too tight, but you just kind of want to just snug enough to kind of see it curl up. That means there's not going to be an excess of binding in your valley. Okay, so now I'm coming to the corner where I'm going up a hill, and this is actually the corner, so the hill kind of goes much more rounded. And again, I'm just laying the binding in here. Now on the corners, it's really important to not stretch it at all. You'll end up with what's kind of called a tulip petal look. So I'm sort of force feeding and going nice and slow. Just giving it plenty of binding in here. Every few inches, make your adjustments. Make sure there's plenty of binding. Alright, almost around the corner. Okay, down the valley of the next side now. Okay, now I'm back to putting a little tension on it, just a slight tug. You can see that binding is going to curl really nicely. And up the other side. So you just continue this process. The hills get a little extra binding, the valleys get a little tug. I'm just going to continue to work my way around. You can kind of see the hills. They sort of do this like lettuce leafing. That's good. That's very good. When this wraps around, that's going to fit well. And then the valleys, you can kind of see them curling up or cupping. And that's good too, because now when they pull to the other side, they're going to be nice and snug and everything will lay flat. So I am just going to keep moving here. A little extra on the hills, a little snug on the valleys. All the way around until I get to my join up point. And once I do that, well then I'm going to stop at just at the crest of the opposite hill, leaving myself about, well, as much as possible, but about 10 inches maybe, 8 or 10 inches of open space to join my two ends. Okay, so here we are. I've sewn it all the way around, and I left my tails unstitched here, so you can probably see my starting point just before the crown of that hill, and I ended as I crowned the hill coming into it. So the whole valley is open. So now what I've got here, I'm going to lay my binding strip down, and I'm just going to kind of use my fingers to create this curve. And then the binding strip coming into it, doing the same thing, creating this curve. Now what I need to do is overlap these 2 2¼ inches. That's because my binding is 2¼ inches wide. Now if your binding is 2½ inches wide, you would overlap them 2½ inches. And you can see here I drew a blue line. So I got my overlap and I I drew my blue line, and I'm just going to use some scissors and cut just beyond that line, or just right up next to it. Okay. So the next thing you do, now this is what I showed in my how to join the ends of the binding together. This is my trick for doing that with the corner clipper tool. So I'll put a link to that video below this one as well in the description box, and you can go watch that to see how I do this, because I really walked through the process and it might be good for a close-up, but I'm just going to quickly do that here. Now I've overlapped the two of them the same width that they are. So I've opened them up. I'm going to place them down right sides together. I think I'll put a couple pins in here just to hold everything in place, just so I don't have too much shifting. Okay, I'm going to lay these down here, and using the 2 1/4 inch line on the corner clipper here, I can trim my ends. So now they will match up beautifully. So I'll put some pins in here and carry on. And this way, what I'm going to do is just stitch my 1/4 inch seam. I'll press it open, and I actually might even stitch it as a heavy 1/4 inch. And the reason I would do that is because it actually puts a little bit of tension. You know how I was putting tension on the valley and just kind of tugging the strip a little bit? So if I sew an extra deep 1/4 inch seam, it'll put a little tension on that joint, and that way it will fit nice and snug into the valley. Press this open. Okay, so that's all joined. I've pressed it open. I pressed it back flat. And now I'm just going to put a couple of pins to secure it in my valley while I sew it. I'm just going to sew it from one edge to the other. Okay, all done, nice and clean. So now everything gets wrapped to the front. I'm going to top stitch it down, and I'll give you guys a close-up with the camera back here behind the machine on that process. Now, if you're sewing it to the front and rolling it to the back to hand stitch, that's the point you would get to before doing that. If you're not going to top stitch it, but instead hand stitch it, you'd pretty much do it to this point, and now you'd be hand stitching. So I will get set up for my top stitching, and we'll be right back at it. Okay, so here we are. I've got it to the machine now, so I'm just pulling the binding from the underside, and I'm going to curl it with my fingers around the top edge, and I'll put it into the machine. Now I've got the full foot sitting on the binding, and I've moved the needle position over to the right a couple of clicks. And now I'm just going to stop with the needle in the down position so that I can keep my place, and then make my adjustments. Now I'm just moving a couple inches at a time, 3 or 4 inches at a time. And just getting the binding laid over. So I'm coming up, and I'm sewing like a 1/16 of an inch from the edge, or an 1/8 of an inch, just very close, like a nice tight top stitch, very close to the edge. Okay, over the top of the hill and now headed down the valley. This is where it's really nice that the valleys are pulled a little bit snug so you don't have a lot of excess slack. And then through the bottom of the valley and up the next hill, and this is a corner, so I'm just going to curl it around most of the corner, but still working just a few inches at a time. And it just naturally wants to cup around those corners. That is really nice. This is why we cut our bias binding. Straight of grain or cross grain binding will not do this. Okay, now we're headed back the other side down into the valley. Little by little. I'm going to see if I can get you guys a different view of this. You can kind of watch from another angle. Okay, let's see. So here you see it. Coming up on the hill, pull, 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 and let it just curl around. The valleys. And towards the hill on the other side. So I'm going to keep doing this. Hills and valleys, and you can see if I can show you just how close of a stitch at the edge of the binding there. Here you see it on the back side, so it's really tight to the binding. It's still visible, but looks pretty even. Some of that just is practice, practice, practice. But I'm just going to keep working my way around the quilt, and then we'll come back when I've gotten the last hill and valley done. All right, here it is. It's all finished. So I've got my binding, wrapping the edge all the way around. Do you see how smooth that is? It is laying so flat, and the corners too. They lay nice and flat. Everything is really flat. What will happen if you pulled too hard on the outside edge is you would get sort of a cupping of the corners especially, but pretty much all the hills. And then the valleys might end up with too much fabric in them. But this method really hasn't failed me. It works really, really well. So that is how it's done. Just like that. So what I said earlier, and promised you, I'm going to put some links in the description box for everything to this point. So how to cut your scalloped edge, how to cut your bias binding on that 45 angle, and then how to join your ends together. Those are 3 other videos that I've done that will really give you the best results when it comes to binding. And then I think maybe what I'll also do is put a link to last week's blog, how to do this charm square quilt. So I just used some scraps in a charm pack that I had, and it's in the blog from last week called So Charming. So I'll put a link to that too if you want to make yourself one of these quilts. It's a very fun project. I hope you found something interesting, inspiring, and educational here. I hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching.